Bizarre is probably the first word that comes to mind when I think of this college football season. It has been straight up crazy. It's been a lot of fun, though, and it started the beginning with Florida State and its destruction, right? Kind of begun at the beginning of the season, leading all the way up to this past rivalry weekend a couple days ago. You've got fights, you got pepper spray, you got flag planting, you had an 8 overtime game. It's been crazy. It's been a lot of fun. People aren't going to forget this college football season. And another bizarre moment, data point, over the course of this whole season was the Georgia-Texas game the first time around. And I want to revisit it. I want to talk about it again. I know that these matchups are different every time. And this matchup, I'm hoping, is going to be different. It was a weird game for Georgia and Texas, and a lot of crazy things happened in that. If it repeats itself, these numbers that I'm going to talk about, then that gives me another excuse to say bizarre again. I'm going to say it probably a couple times in this video, and I could end up saying it this weekend. But Georgia beat Texas 30-15. They went to Austin, and they won that game. Kirby says it'll be different. It will be different. And this time it'll be in Atlanta for the SEC Championship. It won't be an end-all, be-all game, but it will be for a playoff bye. There are three numbers that I want to discuss. I want to talk about the rushing numbers. We'll start there, and then I want to talk about the turnovers, and I want to talk about third downs. To me, when you dissect this game from a statistical standpoint, obviously I watched it and I covered it and I've watched it back, but when you dissect it statistically and just be like, man, like this is what happened, it's a weird game, and it's not so indicative of the way these two teams have been over the course of the football season. Ryan Curley from Dawg Post, link is below for the newsletter. Thank you for watching. Thank you for signing up for that. We can't do it without you guys. That's all I'm going to say. On the newsletter, it's free and it's linked down below. Make sure you're checking it out. The three numbers. Well, here we go. First one, and I'm itchy all of a sudden, man. I'm sorry. The first one, rushing yards. Georgia held Texas to 29 rushing yards in Austin. Now, that gets calculated after you throw the sacks in there, which is something that Georgia did at a really high level in that game, which was get after the quarterback. And I'm going to talk about that a little more later on, but I want to talk about this. Quintravion Wisner, he's a pretty good running back. He's Texas's primary back. Obviously, he wasn't the primary back heading into the season, but this is what it is now. He's good. All right, I thought he looked good against A&M. I thought he's looked good against some of these other teams. He was 15 carries for 52 yards. Even when you just look at that and say, okay, well, this is what the rushing output was without the stats, it's not great either, right? Georgia held them to a respectable number, and that's three and change in terms of yards per carry. Georgia's run defense has not been that good this year, and that's what I'm talking about. The ways that Georgia beat Texas were kind of bizarre. They were kind of weird, and these numbers are weird, and I have a hard time seeing them repeat themselves. It doesn't mean Georgia cannot win this football game in a different way, but winning it the way it did, it would be impressive. It would be very impressive. Georgia ended up running for 108 rushing yards, had the 3 rushing touchdowns. Trevor Etienne had a solid game, over 80 yards from him. A couple other guys contribute to that number, but it was him who had the 3 touchdowns, and they converted off of short fields with Trevor Etienne pounding the rock in there. But they stopped the run, and Kirby talked about that on Monday. He talked about how stopping the run was a big part of holding Texas's offense back. To me, Texas's offense has only been prolific, for the most part, against far worse teams. And this is, I've watched the games. I don't have Texas' schedule in front of me, but pretty sure that the Florida game against the Florida defense was the only time that they put up a large number of points against a really good team. A lot of their 50-point games came against the Cupcakes, 17 points against A&M, 15 points against Georgia. Mississippi State, they ended up with 30-ish. But it was only against Florida, right? Georgia shut down their offense. And shutting down the run game, first and foremost, was a big part of why they were able to do that. Now, Georgia hasn't done that really well recently, especially. But they didn't do it well against Kentucky, over 170 yards. Over 170 yards against Alabama they allowed on the ground. There's a theme here. These are games that Georgia struggled in. Obviously, it's a little bit different. When they allow over 100 yards, Dylan Sampson is the only 100-yard rusher they've allowed. That was against Tennessee. You move on to the following week. And then it gets a little concerning. Georgia allows over 200 rushing yards against UMass, and then Georgia allows over 250 rushing yards, over 260 actually, to Haynes King and the Georgia Tech Yellow Jackets, and they struggled in that game. Stopping the run will be important again. Stopping the run will be very important again. I think that the numbers prove that, and I think that if Texas was able to run the ball well against Georgia, more effectively at least than it did, then we probably would have been talking about a different football game. Now, this next one is probably more important than the rushing stats. And it is something that Georgia has actually struggled with this year as well, and it's the turnovers. Right? They had that stretch, that month-long stretch where Carson Beck and this offense struggled and it's turning the ball over, had an interception problem. I say Carson Beck in the offense because I don't think it was all just on Carson Beck. But Georgia won the turnover battle against Texas, 4-3. Georgia forced 4 turnovers, Texas forced 3. Sloppy game with 7 turnovers in it, right? But Georgia won the battle that day. It has not won that battle every single time this season, and that has been a problem for Georgia. It's been a reason why Georgia has struggled in some of these games this year, is because it was turning the ball over. It did that against Texas, and it didn't really struggle, which is another reason why the game was kind of bizarre. Why? Because Georgia's defense forced turnovers, and it hasn't been forcing them as much as it has, right? We keep saying it used to, as if the championship years are the only ones that exist. It's just recent history and what's on our mind and the standard that Georgia created for itself. But for this team, what it hasn't done is force a lot of turnovers, and they did in that game. And it was because of the pressure that the front seven got at an elite level. And that hasn't happened the entire season. It didn't happen against Georgia Tech. And Georgia defended Tech differently than it normally does by loading up the box, and it still wasn't able to get pressure. But against Texas, it got immense pressure. It had Jalen Walker back there for 3+ sacks. It had him getting multiple fumble recoveries. Tyrion Dawkins back there making a ton of plays. Michael Williams making plays. Damon Wilson making plays. They disrupted. Dalen Everett was getting in the backfield on a corner blitz, on a greatly disguised man coverage blitz that they executed and forced a turnover off of. It was bizarre the way that Georgia was able to just destroy Texas's offense and create all those turnovers. And they still overcame a bad offense performance where Georgia didn't put up 300 total yards and didn't put up 200 passing yards and had 3 interceptions through the air. And I've talked about bizarre and all this weird stuff without bringing up the trash throwing and the overturned call, whatever. But that was one of the interceptions, and it counts because it counted at the end of the day. And I just have a very hard time seeing, because Georgia hasn't done this a lot, but it has given away the football a lot this year, but hasn't taken it away as much. That is a battle that Georgia needs to win again, and can't throw 3 interceptions again. I'm not predicting it's going to happen. I know it's happened multiple times for Carson this year, and I know that throwing for 2 or more has happened a couple of other times, but to me, that is one of the weirdest numbers from this original Georgia-Texas game that I just don't think that we're going to get a repeat of, the 7 turnovers. So I thought that was bizarre. The third number that was bizarre was Texas was only 2 for 15 on third down. Georgia crushed them on third down, and they crushed them by only being 6 for 17. But it mattered. Holding Texas 2 for 15 and 1 for 5 on fourth down. It was one of the best defensive performances of the college football season, and they allowed 15 points in the third quarter. Will Georgia's defense play like that again? It hasn't. It hasn't had a performance like that the rest of the season. It was good against Kentucky in terms of not allowing touchdowns, but it allowed the 4 field goals on those big drives. So it was a statistical anomaly of a game. It was bizarre. It had bizarre things happen to it. These things are just not going to happen again. At least I have a hard time seeing them happen again. I'm sitting here, I'm looking at the numbers, and I keep becoming speechless looking at them, because it's one of the weirdest box scores of the entire year. Georgia only won the time of possession by a minute. It's not like Georgia dominated that. The completion percentage was similar, right? It was a weird one. They were both around 55% completion percentage, but Georgia got the better of them because of the defense, right? It overcame bad offense. Will it repeat that performance? It doesn't have to completely repeat it, but if Georgia plays better on offense and has a solid defensive game, I think you feel good about the Dogs' chances in this one. Thank you for watching.